Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre. With me is Z. This week we have some legal news. We have some follow-up exploits from Real Mode Labs targeting their SD-WAN blog series, and some Windows vulnerabilities. So we'll start off with some of the legal news. So this was some news we didn't get to cover last week. The U.S. Senate unanimously passed the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act on November 17th, for which it's being praised by Rapid7 as well as others that have been long supported and backed that legislation. What this act does is it states that within 90 days of that act being enacted, the National Institute of Standards and Technology will publish standards and guidelines for the appropriate use and management of IoT devices used by federal civilian agencies. And what that includes is some secure development guidelines, patching, identity management, configuration management, and considerations for managing security vulnerabilities. And with that comes the policy that agencies must have a vulnerability disclosure policy. Agencies that don't follow and adhere to those guidelines can't obtain or renew contracts for IoT devices that break those guidelines.
Yeah, so this is
So
both the agencies must have and the contractors. So the vendors who are actually providing the IoT devices, and this is IoT specific, and they do define IoT in the Act. Um, but it is probably going to be a beneficial move kind of for everybody, even though this is very much focused on the government. You know, like I said, the agencies must have the disclosure program. The contractors, the vendors must have the disclosure program, and they must follow the NIST standards. So what'll likely end up happening is devices kind of get created, devices are made so that the government can use them, and that'll kind of trickle down into the consumer use, or at least hopefully that'll happen as they get sold across both when we're talking about something like, you know, IoT light bulbs or something.
yeah, that was my thought as well. Now, this act, it is worth noting, this act hasn't been enacted yet, but considering it's been passed through the House and the Senate, it seems likely that this bill will go through unless it's vetoed by the president. So it seems likely that it would go through. I don't see why this would get vetoed. Now, like you said, this does only apply to government civilian agencies at the moment, and it's a U.S. law. But I think that's still notable because U.S. laws and legislation can have impact outside of just the U.S. We've seen that in the past. The same with like European law as well. And even if other countries don't take, the U.S.'s lead on this, Rapid7 even points out that there will be lessons learned from its implementation that could be valuable to the IoT area as a whole, or even just security as a whole. So I think overall this is positive news.
Yeah, I would definitely agree it's positive. I mean, the NIST issues, or sorry, the NIST recommendations, they're usually going to be fairly conservative recommendations. They're not necessarily going to be right up with like the modern suggestions. I think a good example of that is just looking at the password hashing recommendation. They still recommend, I believe, PBKDF2, which is parallelizable. GPU can crack it. It's better than what people were doing at the time they made the recommendation. I think they first recommended that in like 2010. You know, MD5 was still, I mean, MD5 was being phased out by that point, but still kind of fair. Like it was an improvement, and I can kind of expect to see something similar with NIST recommendation here, where they're maybe not going to be right up to date, but it is going to be better than where we're at with IoT devices. But there is some concern that the NIST recommendations will just be kind of out of whack. That is kind of thing, like they're asking for the recommendations. They're usually made, at least in good faith. So I'm assuming they'll be good, but we don't actually know what those recommendations will be. And I am kind of interested to see what NIST will recommend out of this.
Yeah. So, like you said, IoT is kind of like shooting fish in a barrel right now. What I do question though is how much is IoT really being used in government agencies? Because I doubt they're running like Alexa or something in a government office, but maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know
I
if
mean,
you
I
would.
can imagine things like Wi-Fi bulbs actually being used to a fair degree, just as it's easier to manage. Like a lot of IoT is there to make things just easier to manage.
Yeah, that convenience aspect. I did want to pull a question out of chat from some dude asking about working with ZDI and if you're allowed to make a blog post on your findings. ZDI, yes, generally speaking, after the issue has been patched and they've had their advisory out and whatever, you should be able to write up your issue. Some of the blog posts that we've covered that have been posted on the Zero Day Initiative blog are submitted from their program or they're from the Pwn to Own competition. So ZDI is one of those places where you can submit bugs and you don't have to worry about not talking about them forever, because it's more, once the issue is fixed, they don't really care. I don't think,
Yeah, and
or at least that's what it seems like generally in the past.
ZDI more goes towards the reporting aspect. Like you report to ZDI, they put out the alert to their consumers, like to their alert subscription, and then kind of everybody taking out that question. And you mean you're allowed to host it on your own blog post? I believe so.
Yeah, I think as long as you don't snub them and like put out the information before they can put it out to their customers and it gets fixed, then I don't think they care. So, but I mean, ZDI is pretty open with communication as well. You can communicate with them over email. So I'm sure you can just ask them like, "Hey, is it okay if I talk about this issue?" And I'm almost certain they would be like, "Yeah, that's fine."
Although they
So
do have a reputation of being pretty slow.
they are a bit slow. Yeah. Oh man, yeah. I think the last time I tried to contact them, they took like 4 weeks before I got an email back. So be prepared to wait a little while.
And if
Um,
I remember, they didn't even quite understand your issue at that point.
no, they didn't. So we'll move on to our second legal topic. This one we'll bring up because it's kind of big news when it comes to the CFAA. It's the Van Buren versus United Case States case will be argued today. If that case sounds familiar to people who've listened to the podcast recently, that's because it is. 2 episodes ago, we talked about votes and their independent insight on that case. And it's a case around how the statute applies when someone is authorized to obtain information, but only for certain purposes. So in this case specifically, it was a police officer who accessed license plate information for private purposes and ended up selling that information to an FBI informant, I believe. So yeah, this is kind of it seems like it's a landmark case when it comes to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Yeah, well, this is the first time I believe the CFAA is actually hitting the Supreme Court, and several times, and we've obviously talked about the CFAA before, and I've always kind of come out and said like I dislike the act. It's very vague and has been interpreted in a very vague way in broad ways. Different lower level courts have interpreted in different ways. Um, some of which have been, in my opinion, excessively broad. Kind of taking the idea of like if you violate terms of service, is that a violation of CFA? Are you now an unauthorized user? So one of the examples this the SCOTUS blog gives is if you're using the internet at university, you probably have to do like an acceptable use like policy. You have to sign that or agree to it or whatever. So if you use your laptop during class and you say bring up a YouTube video that isn't actually related to your coursework, a lot of times that's actually going to be against the acceptable use if you're misusing it or if you're misusing a work laptop or something. So now you're no longer authorized. You're violating the acceptable use. You're no longer authorized. Can that then be brought up against CFAA? And one of the main arguments here is that there's no reason under the broad interpretation of unauthorized access why a case like that could be brought, except for the fact that most prosecutors wouldn't actually try and push that case, but the law itself would allow it. And that has some obvious impacts when it comes to security research. You know, accidentally going over the lines of a bug bounty program, doing so in good faith, reporting the vulnerability, getting charged for that. Like it has a lot of impact. It can either, depending on how the Supreme Court comes down on this, it can have a chilling effect on research, as a lot of things kind of become very questionable, just because every company kind of gets to define their own laws. Or they can kind of come in a way that's useful to security researchers. So it's going to be an interesting case. Like I said, it's the first time I believe we've seen the CFAA actually getting discussed at the Supreme Court level.
Yeah, it's something I kind of brought up before on the podcast was like, especially with the U.S. legal system, it's like a wall of bricks, and every new brick that gets set into that wall, it's very hard to change after it's there. And then like new laws are just kind of built on top of that. What's kind of interesting about this case is I think in this specific case, like somebody pulling, a police officer pulling license plate information and selling that information privately. Um, I feel like most people would probably agree that is, at the very least, an abuse of power. Like, I don't think people would find that agreeable. At the same time, because of this case having those other ramifications that you mentioned, it's kind of interesting in the way that you might not support this specific case, but you still might want it to go the way of like opposite of the government here.
Well,
So
the thing is with this guy, what he did is he was authorized to access that information. His use of that information was unauthorized, but he was authorized to access it. And that's kind of where this comes down to. Can you use the CFAA for basically unauthorized actions by authorized users? That's one of the key questions that'll hopefully be answered here.
it's an
And I
interesting
think when you
question.
frame it that way, it makes more sense on where the issue kind of lies. Because I mean, if you just frame it over like, did this police officer do something wrong? Yeah, I think most people would agree that the private sale to an acquaintance. You mentioned it being an FBI informant, but the key thing there is it was kind of like a friend who offered to pay him on that. Who also happened to be an FBI informant. Like there was that aspect to it, but it was definitely happening like outside of the normal legal process.
Yeah. Um, So, if I'm right, I believe we should have this some of the potentially some of the answers to these questions and more information by the end of the day, right?
So
Um,
arguments are being made today. Oh, how long that will take it depends. And I don't think we're going to see an actual answer to it. Like the Supreme Court, I don't believe is going to be ruling on it today. I think they're just hearing the arguments today, which may even go on into tomorrow or into some further days. I'm not sure how long that normally takes on something like this. I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer.
yeah, I mean, with the legal system, it's
Yeah,
always a toss up.
we'll
The
know
the reason
more. We'll know more about what their actual arguments are by the end of the day.
okay, yeah, that's what the reason I brought that up was the last sentence. They say we should know much more about that by the end of the argument on Monday. So I didn't know if they just meant the argument itself or if they meant potentially like which way they were leaning on the decision. But yeah, the way you put it probably makes more sense. That we'd know more about the arguments themselves. So. But yeah, hopefully in the near future we will get some more information about that. Maybe we can talk about it again, depending on how which way the case
Well, I
goes.
mean, regardless of which way this goes, it's going to have a huge impact on security research.
Yeah, which means we'll definitely talk about it. All right, so we have a quick post on how much is unauthorized access sold for. It's also a little bit older than what we typically cover, but we thought it might be worth some cool discussion. It's a study of 100 of the most recent offers on underground forums, like raid forums, to probe for the price of exploits, as well as some metadata about the types of targets um, and how big or small they are, and the type of access that those exploits entail.
So it doesn't quite seem that they're actually selling the exploits, but the access. So this can also, because they do mention like looking for those that are offering elevated access, such as domain admin. So it does sound like these companies have already been compromised. Probably had some backdoor Trojan wrap, whatever installed there that's providing this backdoor access. This kind of post exploitation. It sounds like.
Yeah, fair point. Yeah, it's more of the tools and stuff that are available after it's already been hit. So some of the higher level stats, they found that 48% of victims had fewer than 500 employees, and 81% were from the private sector. Most were from the USA. Financial was the most targeted industry, which doesn't really come as much of a surprise. The next largest was healthcare, followed by government. US, UK, and Australia were the top three countries targeted. When it came to price, the average was about $8,000. There was a few interesting outliers. There was one in the 100,000 and even one close to the $150,000 range. Um, Now, these prices and statistics, they're interesting, but you do have to consider the market that's being observed here. This is the crimeware market, right? It's not the gray market where you're talking about governments, or it's not the white hat market like ZDI. And prices and targets in security are going to be highly dependent on the type of market you're talking about. I would say crimeware probably falls maybe in the middle when it comes to price between like white hat and gray area stuff. Um, One stat I wish we got was the country of the attacker. I imagine that one probably wasn't as easy to see unless the forum user had the country in their public profile information or something, which would be kind of silly considering the type of uh, stuff you're doing on the forum. If I had to guess, though, I'd probably guess that Russia and China have to be up there in the top three
Yeah, I
for like the
mean,
country of where these are coming from.
we have nothing to really base that on. So
Pure guess, but
yeah,
I
I will
almost guarantee
say
it's true.
one thing that I kind of want to bring this particular post up for, though, is we often see people talking about how, oh, that compromise cov, you could have taken that to the black market and sold it for millions or something. And I mean, yeah, we're usually talking about some other larger companies, but quite often the black market isn't the greatest selling place because it's usually people trying to it's usually people, trying to get that mass exploitation. Like a lot of the crime where like they're just trying to make their money back in a little bit. It doesn't have like a lot of this doesn't have a huge value apart from what other value they can derive from it. So that does tend to drive it down a bit. So in this
Um,
case, average price being just under or just over, just under 8,000 at $7,700, which isn't that much.
the other thing I'd be curious about here that I don't think they outline in the blog post is whether or not that access is exclusive, because that is also a major factor. If the access is exclusive, it's typically going to go for a lot more. Whereas if they're just selling to anyone who will come and buy it, um, that price is going to go down significantly, and it'll probably die faster too.
Well, yes and
So
no. So usually, if you're going to buy access like that, you're going to bot kill. You're going to try and get rid of anybody else that is already also compromised that. Um, so it's going to be exclusive by force. You're going to um patch any of the holes or whatever. Or remove the entry point that you had, replacing it with your own. You're not going to trust the buyer, or sorry, the seller.
yeah, but
And that's pretty
specifically if the seller doesn't note that they're selling it exclusively, that's gonna impact the pricing that they expect. That was more what I was getting at with the exclusivity.
but what I'm saying is it's going to be exclusive because anybody that's buying it is going to get rid of the backdoor that was left by the seller.
Well, they'll
Like
try to.
the seller shouldn't have a chance to do that. And that's fairly commonplace.
So something else to keep in mind is this sample size is kind of limited. 100 is, I mean, it's a decent sample size, but it's not huge. But I still think it's big enough where the stats that were pulled out of here are still um, accurate and useful to pull insights out of. But I did just want to note that 100 sample size is something you should probably keep in mind when trying to glean insights from the stats.
Yeah, small sample size. It's also formed, so it's people that don't have, their own connections to sell this. They've got to publicly advertise on these sorts of forums. So that's going to kind of drive the cost down also, just because of the type of person, the type of seller it is. We also don't have any guarantee that it's a legitimate sale, given the
That's the
type of
biggest problem in
content.
black market.
Oh, they can definitely just be lying about it. They don't talk about. I don't believe they talk about what the. Yeah, I don't see it in here. They don't talk about kind of reputation of anybody that's making the sale, and even that can kind of be faked too. So
Yeah. Um, but yeah, like I think this was interesting to bring up because there are a lot of people that ask like, how is there any information on the types of Like when it comes to prices and like the black market stuff, like what does it look like there? And this blog post kind of gives you some insights. So um, yeah, could be interesting for those people. So, getting banned for security research. This was a post by Ned Williamson. He made a personal blog post. He was a PPP player. I don't know if he still plays for them or not in CTS. He's also a Nintendo hacker, and I think he's now part of Google Project Zero. But this post is his alone. It's not tied to his employer or anything like that, as he states at the top of the article. So he states he was reverse engineering the networking code in Call of Duty Warzone, and he got banned. So Warzone and Call of Duty in general has always been touchy when it comes to reverse engineering. I've heard some stories of people before who have just had IDA open in the background. They weren't messing with the game at all. They were just, doing security research, and then they decided to play a game of Warzone. And people's games would not connect to servers. They'd basically get like a soft shadow ban. There would be no error, but it just wouldn't connect to anything. Um, and this is initially what Ned Williamson claimed happened. He said something to the effect of, "I've been banned playing Warzone, presumably for having IDA open." What he left out of that tweet, and what is made apparent in this blog post, is that he didn't just have it open; he was actively observing the game with debugging, and that was what got him banned.
Although
So,
he does mention it was only during or only while he was in the main menu, not while he was actually in a game or like connected online.
yeah. So his goal with this post was to try to advocate to game devs to be more open and provide a way for security researchers to tinker with the game, debug it without the fear of getting banned. I will say there are some people of the opinion that he was trying to cheat here or develop a cheat, and after getting caught, fell back on the security stance. Obviously, we don't know either way, um, but it is very common for like cheat devs and cheaters to fall back on those types of excuses. Um,
At the
and
same
that's
time, I think they should, if you're going to ban them from the game, especially after purchase and all of that. And I don't play Call of Duty, but I'm assuming it's a paid game. Everything I know about would tell me that. Uh, it should at least take them trying to cheat, not the preemptive action. So I've talked before that I used to do a little bit of anti-cheat work and kind of doing some bot detection, cheat detection stuff. And something that we always cared about was making sure we weren't getting false positives. It wasn't just an accidental thing or kind of unrelated, that the users we were catching in any of the so this was quite a while ago, back like 2010. So anti-cheat was very different at the time. Trying to make sure that people were actually cheating, that we weren't going to catch anybody that just accidentally maybe had something open or did something like this. And I feel like a lot of the cheat process now, or anti-cheat process, have gotten kind of overzealous with who they see as cheaters, and anything that is remotely questionable is a cheater. And it's kind of fair game because the Activision user license agreement does mention that trying to do any reverse engineering will result in a ban. That is called out explicitly. I just don't like that companies can actually include that. Like, you can't reverse engineer anything of ours as like a terms of service agreement. Like, it just seems so hostile, but it is there as far as I understand the laws. Like, it is definitely within their right. I do agree that there should be more openness to the security research. It does make cheating easier if they're open to that, but I think they should focus on actually catching the people cheating, not just those, who have IDA open, as you mentioned, or something like this.
So I think part of the reason they do those blanket bans is kind of what I was saying earlier with excuse possibility for cheat devs just to be like, "Oh, I was just trying to do security research." Not saying that's what Ned Williamson did, but there are definitely other people out there who would do that, and I think that's why the game devs do the blanket bans like this in the first place, so that that dog ate my homework type excuse doesn't hold up and they don't have to deal with them.
I mean,
Related
that's true, but they should have enough evidence to say, no, you actually tried to cheat in the game, not just you did some analysis, but actually see that cheating happened. And yes, that gets difficult. but I do think there should be a higher bar when you're taking away something people have actually paid for.
So on that note, Call of Duty Warzone is free to play. It's the free to play battle royale mode. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
not a paid game. And in that case, I do have less of a aggressive stance on it because I agree. If you pay for something, especially, the ban needs to be like heavily justified. You know, if you're paying $70 for a game and then you get locked out of it, that's kind of stupid. Where this one's free to play, I am a little bit more lenient when it comes to that. Um, but yeah, I mean, what you were saying earlier with having a major focus on trying to prevent false positives, Valve is doing really good with that with Valve Anti-Cheat back. They have a very heavy approach of making sure that they don't ban people who don't deserve it, and they're quick to resolve any ban waves that are based on like a bug or a glitch or something like that. And that's because they want to instill confidence in the anti-cheat. That way people can't go, "Hey, I got banned, but I wasn't cheating." They want to make sure that that argument is completely dead in the water. So Valve has been doing a good job in that respect. I feel like other companies like Blizzard, like Activision Blizzard, and that they're kind of falling off the wayside when it comes to that, unfortunately. Um, so yeah, it just seems like people should more companies should probably strive to be like Valve in that regard with not being overzealous with their anti cheats.
Yeah, I agree. They should definitely strive in that direction. Obviously, as a private company, they can, they could ban everybody if they wanted to. Um, Mentioning that it's free to play does, I guess, make some difference. So I just assumed Call of Duty. I just assumed it was like any other Call of Duty I've heard of, where it was a, full featured paid game. I wasn't aware of um, this battle royale version. So
Yeah,
that does,
Warzone's kind of the exception to the rule.
yeah, that does make a bit of a difference. But at the same time, I still kind of hold that. Actually, out of chat, 0x33 count mentions whatever runs in our computer, we should have the right to analyze. Like, I do agree with that. I can agree with having some reservations when it does come to actively analyzing the multiplayer games. But I can get into a much longer discussion about how we should also be able to run our own servers.
Yeah, that's where I was kind of gonna go with this. Actually, was I agree with the stance that publishers should try to have a more open security stance. Again, kind of like Valve. Valve has that open bounty program. Um, and they provide the ability to test like the networking stuff and whatnot on non-public or private servers to test things without messing with the game integrity. So they basically have back protected servers and non-back protected servers that you can run on your own or whatever. So that option gives you the route to, you can still debug the game and do whatever, do security research. You just can't do it on back protected servers, which is it hits that middle of the road, which I think is the sweet spot. Um, Now, when it comes to how you could implement that for games like Call of Duty, you could either have public test servers that are ran by Activision, or they can be self-hosted by the developer. The latter I don't see happening with games like Call of Duty because they don't want server code being publicly accessible, I don't think. But public test servers, I think, would be an excellent solution to this. That being said, it's Activision Blizzard. They probably don't care. They're probably not going to do anything about this. Um, but yeah, I do wish more game dev companies had a more open security stance, especially because of their when you're talking about games and game engines and the networking stack, there is the potential for it to be used as an RCE vector. Um, it's kind of like a browser in that sense. It's not maybe as juicy of a target as a browser, but it is an RCE vector. And I think public test servers are probably the only golden silver bullet, I guess, for this problem.
Yeah, which is fair, I think. I think having the route for researchers, having something available for them.
Yeah. Now taking something out of chat, that thing you mentioned earlier from Hex33 with whatever runs in our computers, we should have the right to analyze. I mean, you could get into that discussion where that kind of breaks down is okay. What about DRM? When you're hitting DRM, at least from a legal standpoint, that gets a lot more questionable, and there could be ethical questions around that too. So I think there's a lot of nuances to that discussion, and maybe we'll do a discussion video on that on some later date. But I think if we did that in the podcast, we'd go like 3 hours long.
Well, it's not like we've never done that before.
That's true. It's true.
I do, before we go on to the next topic, I do want to take one other question off chat, which is from uh Fardentaba. I'm not exactly sure, as usual, how to say that, but what are your thoughts on Sec 760 course by Sans? They call it advanced, is it? So I have not taken Sans 760. I haven't taken actually any Sans courses.
They're very expensive.
Yeah, I've looked at 760. My understanding is that they do keep it reasonably up to date. Like, they do update it every year, adding kind of new content, looking at new exploits. So it is reasonably up to date. I don't believe it gets as advanced as the offensive security OSCE, their advanced Windows exploitation one, which I believe actually reaches to the point of like hitting the hypervisor and stuff, or so I've heard. I also haven't taken that one. I don't think Sec 760 is really worth the cost, especially if you're going to be paying nearly $8,000 for the course. I don't think it's worth it. But is it advanced? Like, I believe it at least gets you. If they're doing IE 11, then so it depends on the context. Like, is that as far as it goes, or do they start with an IE 11 vulnerability?
I think the highest it goes is it goes to Windows kernel. So they kind of go, they talk about mitigations and debugging with IDA Pro and stuff, and then they get into some Linux userland, some Windows userland, and then Windows kernel. And I think that's basically as high as it goes in terms of difficulty.
Then yeah, I wouldn't bother with it. Oh, Chatty just mentioned they end with IE. Then yeah, that doesn't seem like a good choice, especially at the cost. Like I said, I believe OSE is probably one of the better choices out there from what I know about the course and what I've seen Morton say about it. Yeah, I mean, Sans is just so expensive unless your company's just paying for it. Like, if it's going to be free for you, whatever, it's free training. But if you've got to pay out of pocket, I doubt it's worth it. At the same time, like, courses do have their value. Having somebody else lay out, here's what you should learn in what order, and provide resources to do exactly that has its benefit. Even if the course isn't the greatest, you're still going to learn something out of it.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because some of their courses do have some interesting content, and I would like to take it. I just don't want to pay $8,000 for it. It's just their course prices are kind of absurd,
Yeah, I
in
mean,
my
for
opinion.
anybody wondering, most of their courses are between like 7 and 8,000. I think like most on-demand ones are like $7,600. And they're 4 to 5 day courses.
Yeah. All right, so we'll move back into some of our topics. We'll move into our exploit section of the show. We'll kick it off with some follow-ups from Real Mode Labs on SD-WAN. So we covered part 2 on the last episode with Citrix. In this episode, we're covering part 3 and part 4, and these are the final parts in the series. So part 3 is in Cisco vManage, where they detail 4 vulnerabilities, though I think only 3 of them were used in the final RCE chain that they chained together. The first vulnerability wasn't part of the chain. It was an arbitrary file write combined with a server-side request forgery in the data service statistics subsystem. Um, they take 2 parameters, being the adjacent machine's IP address and the stats file name, and both of them have broken validation. The IP, there's an SSRF because any IP can be passed to the IP parameter, and the token and file type parameters were used to construct a path to write the file contents to, but there's no checks against directory traversal. So you could just download attacker-controlled file contents and overwrite any file with them using the directory traversal. They stated this alone could probably be used for RCE, but they didn't use it in their final chain. Um, Getting into the chain they used, they had another directory traversal through the disaster recovery endpoint for downloading tokens. It exposed a single parameter to download files, but again, no checks against directory traversal. So they were able to use that to info leak the private SSH key from the file system. Even with that SSH key, though, commands are validated that get sent through SSH. Normally, only commands starting with SCP-F are allowed to allow for secure file copies. But again, there's no checking here. You can just do a straight up command injection by terminating that command and writing your own command in there. Um, Finally, they abuse the BusyBox TFTP applet to privilege escalate to root. BusyBox is a set UID binary, so it runs as root, and the TFTP applet had no restrictions on the destination path for uploading files. So you could just use that applet to replace files like etc shadow to insert your own root account and get root access. So really, all of these issues are kind of memes. There's no clever validation bypass or edge case. There's just nothing being validated in like any of these endpoints.
Yeah, and I will
They're
mention, while they didn't use the first vulnerability, the arbitrary file right, you also, assuming the read wasn't there, you could have used the arbitrary file right to write that private key or write your own private key to gain access to. So it is still like worth knowing that it was there. If they only fix the other three, that's still an issue.
yeah. Um, so the final SD-PWN article, part 4, is in VMware's VeloCloud. Three vulnerabilities in this one. First one was an authentication bypass, essentially via password reset on a backdoored user. This comes down to two issues. For one, the way they generate password reset links or password reset tokens is they use the user's hashed password as the reset key. The second issue is the hashed password for the backdoor user is static. It's not newly generated and randomly generated on new installations. So, and the problem is once you reset the password for that account using the fixed hash password, that account becomes active, whereas the backdoor accounts are previously disabled by default.
Yeah,
Um,
which is a sane thing to do. Like, they have the backdoor account, maybe not the best idea, but they have one. Presumably these are static passwords that only really they know, which again, kind of fair to do that. Not the greatest move. We've seen that cause problems with other issues too, especially on IoT and hard-coded passwords. But like, having it default off, like, that kind of makes sense. The fact that you can reset the password of an account that's been disabled is kind of part of the issue here too. But yeah, as you're saying, just you need to use actual randomness. A user's password or password hash is not sufficiently random. Well, it is random, but it's not unpredictable.
yeah. So there were two other vulnerabilities as well that are hittable once you have that authentication access. There was an SQL injection in the get software updates method. They take this modulus parameter and concatenate it into an SQL query. They don't use prepared statements or anything to do that, so you can just extract info out of the database by exploiting an SQL injection there. The other issue was a directory traversal, which can facilitate unauthenticated file inclusion to allow arbitrary JavaScript to be ran on that machine. And this is because they pass a parameter to the REST meta API called original URL, which gets used to require in a file, and that gets taken as a full get query. So if you pass like a double dot, for example, after the query sign, um, you can just get a directory traversal there, which can allow you to include any JS file on the system. Now, they state this issue could be exploited without authentication. The trouble is you need to get a JavaScript file on that local file system in order for it to get executed, which they use that previous authentication bypass to exploit. They theorize some ways you could exploit that without the access, maybe by using like the proc file system and doing it over the network. But it didn't end up working out. So they just, since they had the authentication bypass, they just decided to leverage that. Um, so overall process, you reset and enable the backdoor account, upload a JavaScript file, and use the syslog access to find where that is, and you use the file inclusion to run the JavaScript code that you upload. Um, Interestingly, there's no timeline provided on this one, which is kind of weird because I think all the other blog posts they did have a timeline, but they do provide some closing remarks, summarizing all four of the blog posts, basically stating that all the issues in their series could have been caught by standard security reviews. Many of them were trivial issues, as you could see in these two topics that we've covered. I mean, directory traversal is basically the keyword of the day when it comes to the SD-PWN series. They also do a quick tease on stating they're going to be posting in the future about an everyday gadget many of us use. So that'll be interesting to see. We'll probably be covering that whenever that arises. Um, but yeah, I like this series of posts from Real Mode Labs. I think all of them were really well written, concise, and to the point.
Yeah, it was definitely a good series. Yeah, I've liked it. Things were always clear. They didn't spend too much time on fluff.
Yeah, it felt like everything I read was relevant. So that's why I'm interested in keeping a lookout for what they're teasing for their next blog post. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
actually, I
that'll be
just
fun to
took a
see.
look here, but it looks like also the SD-PWN is all of the content they've ever posted. So that was their first series and only series at this point.
Hey, good first series. Opened
Yeah.
up strong. So all right. So we'll move on to Rapid 7. They had a OpenCRX unverified password change issue. So this was an issue in OpenCRX, which is a customer relationship management platform. It's used for product and price management, sales pipelining, issue tracking, and activity tracking. There's a lot of features it provides, and this is yet another issue in the password reset functionality. Seems to be an area developers are really struggling to get right. This time it's even more trivial though. Instead of a flimsy pass the hash like check that we saw previously, this time they don't even check the reset token. They're just like, oh, you provided. I don't even know if they check if you provide one, honestly.
So,
But
so the issue here, this is kind of an administrative functionality. So they've written the one piece of code for changing the user's password, and they've kind of patched in the admin aspect to it, where an admin can change anybody's password. So what happens is they're not using a token in this case. In this case, it's supposed to be the normal change password. So like there is a token, or for normal users, it'll just like you enter your old password. If you're like enter your old password, then enter the new one. So when admins go to change it, they don't necessarily know what the old user's password was, or at least they shouldn't know what the old user's password was in most situations. So they're not going to be prompted to enter what was the old user's password. So the check that they actually put in code, I've actually got the patch here, I'll bring up. But basically they had this Boolean flag, just verify old password. And that was basically if the user was an admin, they wouldn't verify the old password because, you know, they're resetting another user's account. The problem is they don't actually check if they're resetting another user's account. They just assume they're an admin, therefore they won't check the old password. So what that ends up creating is the CSRF situation, where somebody could CSRF the admin to change their password because it's not going to check if the old password was actually provided or not. So it's just kind of the misapplied administrative functionality.
so it's yeah, it's still an issue, and but it is more mitigated than some of the previous ones we've covered. Um, and it's also worth noting that OpenCRX usually isn't just sitting exposed on the internet. That's another thing they mentioned in the blog post. So this would probably be more useful for something like what you were talking about, maybe using like a CSRF or like maybe like an insider attack. Although that probably
Well, an
doesn't really
insider
hold
could
up
change
either.
their own password.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess that doesn't really hold up either.
CSRF is really, I think, the primary concern here.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I feel like we might want to like rename the episode to like password reset issues because I think is this the third one we've covered? we're
Yep.
really that system is really getting hammered in some of the topics we're covering. So archive tar from pair. We have two vulnerabilities in the pair archive tar package for handling tar files in PHP, both related to bad handling of file names. The first issue is far unserialization. Far is kind of like the PHP equivalent of jar files. It's used for packing PHP code into archives. Um, they tried to prevent utilization of the far wrapper by checking for the far :/ in the file name, but they don't normalize for the case. So if you just pass uppercase far, it'll still get passed and from. Um, Second issue is directory traversal, which can allow file overwrite. This is an issue we've talked about before when it comes to extracting archives, and it's another issue related to stream wrappers not being checked. They use the file wrapper. So you can use that to overwrite any file that the user that's running the PHP process has access to. So if the PHP process is running as root, then you could overwrite stuff like etc shadow. That being said, that's probably unlikely. I don't know why you do.
Pretty unlikely, yeah. It's usually
Yeah.
going to be a much more limited user that's just handling PHP. That said, you can still get your standard code execution from that by being able to overwrite. You can overwrite a PHP file, and then you've got code execution there, assuming you know where the file is located.
Yeah. So the proposed solution to this was to just prevent // from even being allowed in file names at all, to prevent all wrapper attacks. Because when you're talking about these stream wrappers, there's probably a lot more ways that you could take advantage of that aren't listed here. These were just the ones that they found that could be like fairly easily exploited.
Yeah, and to
So
be clear, you mentioned it at the start, but I do just want to mention it again that this is in the tar processing. So this is when you like upload a tar file and then it automatically will extract it. You can have these sorts of names inside of it, which isn't an unknown issue. It does try to protect against it, and it does so poorly. And one of the key things here is this does impact or did impact something like Django, which well-known framework or at least I think this is the one that impacted um that I had a note about. Yeah, I believe this is though where they kind of fell vulnerable to this because they use this library to handle the tar files. So even though it does check for like the far uh specifier, you're still able to get around it.
yeah, it's one of those issues where it's in a library that other things can depend on, and that can end up screwing you over. And our next topic is also along similar lines. We have SSRFs caused by bad
Oh,
regex in
I'm
private
I'm
IP.
sorry. I just want to correct myself. It was Drupal, not Django. I think Django's a Python one, so that one makes sense here. But yeah, Drupal put out an alert indicating that they were also impacted by this.
I expect an apology video, Z.
Well, this is it. I apologize for that mistake.
Okay, we'll clip it out and put it in the video. But yeah, we'll move on. So yeah, private IP, which is an npm package. There are multiple SSRFs in that package, which is the private IP package is basically used to determine whether or not an IP is private or public. And the way they check for that is by doing regular expressions. Originally, they used 9 different regular expressions to try to check for private IPs. I'm not going to read out all 9, but essentially they were trying to check for things like 192.168.0.1 and other reserved loopback addresses.
Yeah, they
Um,
check for all the proper uh private ranges, like the standard any reserved range they look for, and all this exposes the is private IP function. Um, yeah, as you were going to go into, but I guess I will. Is basically you can use some encoding, so like use it would the regex would match like 0.0.0.0 and say yes that's private, but if you send like 0.0.0.0 and like doing that sort of encoding, suddenly that would be like, nope, that's not private. You can go ahead and send it there, which will hit localhost. There were a few other ones that here basically get away with, and that just wouldn't completely or wouldn't match everything. They have a whole list of ones that just wouldn't get matched also. But yeah, this was used in a library. So a lot of things that might have been trying to prevent SSRF ended up being caught or ended up not actually catching some of those internal IPs. I guess not preventing SSRF, but preventing SSRF from hitting those internal IPs. And that just this is one of those issues where it's, they're using a blacklist and they're not normalizing the data. Normalization here is actually, I think, more important. So
yeah,
the solution ended up being they effectively parse the IP down like properly and see if it's inside of a range rather than just trying to match it with regex.
yeah, they do it at the byte level instead of the string level. And I think they also rewrote it so that it's a bit more readable because like those regular expressions, if you read that and try to maintain that let's say something's missing and you wanted to add something there. This looks like crap to try to maintain. The rewritten version, they just define an array of like the ranges, and then they convert that into a net mask and check it at the binary level. So yeah, they state here if anyone is relying on private IP to try to mitigate SSRF directly or indirectly, update it to the latest version, which is 2.0.0. Um, and this is one of the problems that you end up with in situations where you're heavily using npm packages, because either you could be using a package directly that has a vulnerability, or you could be using a package that depends on another package that has a vulnerability in it, and it would be like really hard to know. I believe the way this was originally discovered was for several months the author was trying to fix like multiple SSRFs, not realizing that the issue was all coming down to this package, until he collaborated with another researcher. So this post was kind of a solid mix of work between four people: Sick Codes, John Jackson, Nick Saylor, and Harold Hunt. Because I think Sick Codes and Nick Saylor provided the solution. But one thing you mentioned to me, Z, was this bug's been around for a long time. um, I think you
Yeah,
said
it
it's
looks
been
like
around
it's
for
been
like four
around
years.
for about 4 years. Yeah.
Yeah, which seems surprising to me, that it wouldn't have been reported before now. Maybe it's just one of those things that was known but just wasn't reported for some reason. Because it seems hard for me to believe that this would go unnoticed for 4 years. Because this breaks the entire purpose of that package, right?
But only in
So
some cases. So, I mean, a pen tester, say, who's on an assessment who comes across this, they're just going to find a way around it, mention that, and move on. They're not necessarily going to track it down to the fact that it was private IP, like the specific package, because they may not even have access to know that. So I think the fact that it is kind of a library that just happened to be in common um, makes it a little bit more difficult to track down. And again, because it does still hit like your normal case, your normal test case, you give it some of the classic IPs, and it's like, nope, that's blocked. It's only kind of when you take it a step further that it's actually caught. And I'm not sure like what big projects actually use this.
yeah, I couldn't give you a listing there. There probably is a lot that use it indirectly though, through dependencies on other packages. So, oh, you brought up the
Yeah,
dependence
I brought
list.
up a list here, but like nothing.
Nothing's really jumping out at me
Yeah.
that I recognize. So maybe not as
Did
widespread of an issue as I initially thought it might
I
be.
guess I see some IPFS. That's at least I recognize that, but I don't think that's used very often or like widely used. But
Yeah, but bottom line, if you use it, update it
yeah,
as per usual.
and blacklist bad.
Blacklist bad. That's your. We should get a T-shirt with that on it, because I think that's like one of your favorite
Well,
sayings.
blocklist bad, I guess. Now,
Yeah, yeah, blacklist bad. So we have a last minute ad from Z, so I'll let you jump into this one, Z, because I didn't really get a chance to look at it too much, but I know you wanted to bring it up.
yeah, this was just disclosed actually, like I guess an hour and a half ago or whatever, something like that, maybe two. And this is from NomSec. So if you kind of watch Twitch for other security streamers, probably recognize him, or I think he was actually streaming about this right before we started. But this is a vulnerability in Snapchat, server-side request forgery. Not too interesting on that side. It's just they have functionality under the business side to effectively import media. You can give it other URLs, it'll pull the media down. It's kind of a classic place where you are going to see that server-side request forgery. What was interesting here is that they did manage to use the DNS rebinding to actually exploit this to gain access to more sensitive endpoints. So if you're not familiar with DNS rebinding, the basic idea is that you create a domain that's going to respond with a very low time to live. So that way you make your first request to the domain and it's going to it should respond with like the attacker's IP address. So server goes there, loads up their attack page, whatever, some JavaScript, But then you kind of delay that page a little bit and have it make another request. It's going to make the same DNS request. A few minutes later, some point outside of that time to live, so it has to make the DNS request again. And on that second request, you change the IP to point to, say, an internal IP address. And that'll let you kind of get around the same origin policy because it thinks you're still accessing the same origin, like the JavaScript and that content are from the same origin. So it's just interesting to see that actually being exploited in the wild. Now, this was 2 years ago. It took that long to actually get this disclosed. It does sound like it took them a fair amount of time to actually figure out how to go about solving this issue. But I did just think it was interesting to see, like, in the wild DNS binding attack. And there's quite a bit of discussion between them as they've censored some of the content, but yeah,
Something interesting I just noted, sorry, was there's no severity rating on this, which is I don't know if I've ever seen that before on any of the HackerOne reports we've covered. I wonder why that's the case, that they didn't assign a rating to
perhaps
it.
something Snapchat does.
Yeah, I don't know. I know we've covered Snapchat reports in the past, and I don't remember that being the case, but um, yeah, I feel like, especially considering they paid like $4,000 for this, that it has to be.
I mean, so
Yeah,
they used it to, yeah, and they do have it on some other things. So they did use to get access to the Google Cloud metadata that includes being able to like create keys. So like it is a fairly impactful thing, but yeah, it is interesting that there's no rating. That might just be some that kind of slipped through. As I said, this was reported a year ago, or sorry, reported 2 years ago. And then a year ago, they actually have a more discussion about what can be done, which, because this came up so close to when we actually started streaming, I've not had a chance to review all of it. Although, like I said, I do believe Nomsec was streaming specifically about this. So you can check out his channel if you kind of want to hear more about it from the person who, or from one of the people involved with finding it.
I will say I went to the Snapchat HackerOne page, and they do have like a tier rating for bonuses based on the severity, and $5,000 is high severity. So, um, yeah, you can just kind of slot that in there and pretend like that no rating doesn't exist, I guess. But yeah, it's it seems like a pretty impactful issue, so those are always fun to bring up.
Yeah, or at
And we haven't
least
talked
it
about
can
Snapchat in a
be
while.
impactful. I believe some browsers now do implement some mitigations against DNS rebinding. I'd have to go and look into that. Like I said, this is kind of a last minute ad, so I didn't get to dig into it as much as I might normally.
Yeah, that's fair. So Tesla is back on the podcast again with flaws in their keyless entry system. So Belgian researchers from COSIC discovered that key fobs used Bluetooth Low Energy (BLE), and one of the things you could do was wirelessly force the key fobs to advertise themselves as connectable BLE devices, and you could remotely update the software running on the chip. And that remote update mechanism was not secured, in quotes, which would allow you to pull valid unlock messages. So using that, they could unlock the car, they could connect to the diagnostic interface and pair using a modified key fob due to a vulnerability in the pairing protocol. So it comes down to two issues, one being that remote update mechanism not being secured, and the second being the vulnerability in the pairing protocol. Unfortunately, there's like zero technical details on either of these issues. It sounds like the
Yeah,
first
there's
vulnerability, especially, is quite complex because they mentioned it takes like almost 2 minutes to pull off, or
it
one and a
takes a
half
while.
minutes.
Like these are probably crypto issues, given the researchers are like their previous issues have been crypto related. I believe they're part of like a crypto research group. So we're going to see this at, yeah, actually I'll chat Buzz, I'm sorry, I'm going to screw up all the names today, but mentions that there will be a talk at Real World Crypto and a paper at some point. So we'll find out more about this. It kind of annoys me that the guys from Coast just went directly to Wired to put out one of their publications. I had to dig a little bit for this one. The Wired one, I think, is kind of getting most of the links here, and they put out a entertaining video alongside showing off their hack. But yeah, these are probably like some deeper kind of crypto issues. So interesting, but like it's not as simple as just like, you know, the BLE device could, like they could, like once they update, they could just pull all the keys and like everything was super easy to pull off. I imagine there was more effort in that. Like I said, it did take a couple minutes to do. You had to be within 5 meters. Out of chat, I'm actually not sure why that URL is showing there, but I will link that. I'll link the, well, I guess the proper one is linked in there.
Yeah,
Just a
just a
display
UI
problem.
bug. Yeah.
Yeah.
So while we don't have technical details yet, they do detail some of the hardware they used. They said they used a Raspberry Pi with a can shield, a key fob and ECU from a salvage vehicle, and a lithium battery. So all in all, they used like a $200 setup to steal like $100,000 cards. So you know that's I like that we at least got some of the setup information. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, Z.
Yeah.
If you were gonna say something.
No, I was done, but I will say now also, part of it, like it seems like the key fob cloning, so that first step could also just be defeated with a rock through the window. You, like they have that, like they changed these two issues. But in terms of stealing the car, it comes down to access to that diagnostic port, which is just once you're inside.
Which
So
does kind of surprise me that that's easily accessible to somebody who doesn't like take apart the car. I don't know if that's like a common
it
like
shouldn't be that difficult to get to either. Like, I mean, I think on most vehicles you've got like the ODB2 port, which should be
is it like
fair
right under
point.
the steering
Actually,
wheel?
the out of chat there, the rock might activate a car alarm, which is actually a fair point. Whereas this wouldn't.
I mean, also remember that Elon did that presentation that showed a big
Yes.
ball not even being able to get through the window. He said it wouldn't crack it, but he lied, of course. But you know, some of them, if they're using that stronger window, then maybe this is a more viable attack for you to use.
Oh,
Um,
it's still a more interesting attack regardless.
yeah. Apparently Tesla has pushed out a over-the-air update to mitigate these issues. The fact that they said mitigate and not resolve makes me think these issues might be too complex to rectify with just an over-the-air update, which is maybe why they were holding off on publishing any technical details. Um, that's kind of speculation on my part, though. Just by that, maybe they just use mitigate in like a um, maybe that does mean the issues have been fixed and I'm just reading too far into it. I don't know. But it does sound like it's a design flaw and not just some like logic bug or something, which if it comes down to the crypto, would make a lot of sense. So if that's the case, maybe it is fair that we don't have all the technical details right up front. Although I didn't know about that point that there would be a talk at Real World Crypto. Sorry, I don't remember if you mentioned it. When is that? Do you know?
I don't know.
Just gonna
I
take a
believe
quick
it's
look.
usually Q1, but I
Okay.
might be thinking of.
Yeah, it's January 11th to January 13th, 2021. Okay. So not that far out, only like less than 2 months out. So okay, cool. So yeah, maybe we'll cover it again when we have some of the more technical information, but mostly the discussion on this topic is more meta because we just don't have too much to talk about on the technical side. But in these final issues, we do have a lot to talk about on the technical side. We have some Windows vulnerabilities to cap it off. So first, we have a Windows print spooler issue. It's a privilege escalation. It exists because of the point and print technology that's used for downloading driver and configuration files from a print server. It seems you can change the configuration files for added printers to load a module in the registry. It'll initially try to load that module from the system directory, which is locked down. But if you specify one that doesn't exist in the system directory, it'll fall back on the spool drivers environment version directory. So that's the version 4 driver directory, which was introduced in Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012. Now, what's notable is that directory isn't present on newer systems. I presume that's because v4 is the default on Windows 10, and that path is just a legacy path. Um, Now, so yeah, like I said, that directory is usually absent, meaning if you specify a module that doesn't exist in the system, it'll just fail to load the module. Um, but and also what's notable is because of access control lists, you usually can't create directories side of that environment directory, but you can indirectly create them by modifying a printer spool directory and having it get created with when the spool service initializes. So if you specify an unknown module, create a printer, and change its spool directory to the x64 4 version directory, you can write DLL files in there without needing any privileges to write into that directory, and then get that module loaded as system. So it's a DLL hijack.
Yeah, and
Um,
that's just because the spool directory will always be, when it gets reinitialized, it'll be world readable. Kind of has to be because any user can print to it, so any user needs to be able to write into there.
exactly. It's remarkably similar to the print daemon issue we covered back in May. And funnily enough, this issue was also discovered in May, though it is a little bit different. Print daemon allowed you to write DLL files into an otherwise protected directory. This loads DLL files from a directory that you shouldn't be able to create. Um, Now, I did find how they triggered the spool service to restart interesting, because if I remember correctly, that wasn't really covered in Print Daemon, or maybe it was, and I just forget. But basically, they made it load the
They
app.
in Print Demon they have found a crash that they could use.
Right, it was like a null deref or something, right?
Yeah, I
They
don't remember the details on that one, but they did find some crash that they could use. They did cover something for it.
Okay. Basically, what they did in this case was they took an easier approach. They made it load the app v terminator library as a module, and that library, as the name suggests, it ends up calling terminate process, and it just kills the process. So in a way, there's almost two issues here. For one, you're able to create a directory which has fallen back on, which you probably shouldn't be able to do. Creation of that directory should be blocked, or that directory just shouldn't be a fallback directory because it seems to be a legacy thing. The second issue is you shouldn't be able to load a library like app-v-terminator that just kills the process. That seems kind of antithetical to what you would want, because the spool process is not killable by the user by design. They don't want the user to be able to restart that service. So it shouldn't be able to load a module like app-v-terminator. Now, unfortunately, we don't have uh, details really on how this issue was fixed. So I don't know exactly how they fixed it. I imagine they just made it so that it doesn't fall back on that directory anymore. I don't know if they also fixed the trick where you can kill the process using FB Terminator. I imagine they would have, but I don't know. Maybe they didn't. It's hard to really know there, unfortunately. Um, but yeah, I like this issue. It's very informative, and it's more stuff on the print spooler service. I think I liked it a little bit better than the print demon article, actually. I think this one was a little bit easier to read, for
Definitely
me at
easier to
least.
read. I mean, so
Yeah.
Print Demon was out of the Windows internal blog, so they tend to include a lot of really deep internals. I mean, and it's understandable given the fact that they're a Windows internals blog. Like, I understand why they do that, but it does make a lot of their write ups, when they do have the exploit write ups, more difficult to read.
Yeah. For somebody that's not engrossed into Windows stuff.
Yeah,
And our last article does fall into that category because it is a Windows internals blog post. This one is from Yarden Shafir, exploiting a simple vulnerability in 35 easy steps for less. So basically, the theme of this article, as you can tell, it's very long. It's like 5,000 words. The general idea is the bug itself is kind of trivial, but the exploit is far from it, as the title suggests. Z, do you want to take this one away?
yeah. So with this one, except the issue. So actually, before I jump to the issue, I do want to talk about one of the side comms that they make here, and they're dismissive of these other vulnerability reports and research that go into showing proof of concept, showing successful exploitation, usually a blue screen or something, with kernel address being set to 0x4141414141, as that sort of analysis being cute and splashy. And they're kind of dismissive towards those sorts of reports, because they don't look into the full exploitation of the issue. And I feel like, well, I've already said, I feel like that's kind of dismissive of that work, because a lot of security research, if you're wanting to look at the vulnerability, you're wanting to look at what caused it. The actual exploit development, as interesting as that is, isn't really useful for the defensive side of things. It has more of an offensive use.
It's usually redundant, yeah. I mean, it's cool if you can do that work and demonstrate the exploitability. Sometimes vendors will ask you to do that, but more often than not, they just want the, root cause analysis and is it potentially exploitable or isn't it for triaging. They usually don't care beyond that. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I mean, as much as now, don't get me wrong, I like seeing these write-ups that include more of the exploitation. That is still an interesting area. I'm not trying to dismiss exploitation as something I don't care about at all. It's just there is value on those, and it's more than just cute. It shows what you need, in terms of enough on how to fix the issue, enough on defending against it. The actual exploitation is interesting, but for other reasons. Like, there's value in both of them. It just feels a little bit dismissive of that sort of security research. So with that out of the way, getting into the actual vulnerability, it's simple because in this function, the gist of it is you gain a gadget through the ETWP notify GUID call, to effectively increment an arbitrary address. He goes into more detail there about how it's the actual vulnerability, which is actually kind of an interesting setup. So what ends up happening is you've got this reply requested value, and in theory it should be a 0 or a 1, and the two comparisons that they perform against it, one piece of code does if reply requested is not equal to false, and then elsewhere the comparison that performs against reply requested is this equal to true, which creates a issue where you can have, if you give it the value, say 2, that will fall into 1 but not the other. It'll be truthy, but it's not equal to the false value, but it's also like not equal, so it'll fall in there. So that division basically is where the vulnerability gets created from. Like I said, it just results in an incrementing of an arbitrary address. As is usual, as we were just saying about when internals, they go into a lot of details about triggering it, about a lot of the issues like finding the right GUID to use, registering one, various issues. What they get to, though, is you're able to arbitrarily increment some pointer. That's your gadget, and I don't think a lot of the details need to be covered in order to kind of understand this issue. But then, like I said, they do go into what you do after you've got that primitive. How do you actually go into exploiting this? And they look at exploiting the token privileges. So they find their process token and try and increment it to get a useful privilege in there. I want to say they do one of the debug ones, like sysdebug or something. I believe they mention it in here, but I don't have it. Don't have it up to actually pull up here. But effectively, they're incrementing their token until they're able to get that privilege. They run into several issues here, like, okay, they're not actually able to increment any address as much as they want because nobody's reading those notifications, so they're limited to incrementing just the 4. They introduce another problem there where they can get around the increment number with providers, but then they're limited on the number of providers. But the solution they actually end up going with is, rather than incrementing from the base address of that token, if they only need to increment like the 3rd byte of it or something, shift the address by 3 bytes and increment there, to get around the fact they can't actually just arbitrarily increment it through like an entire 4-byte int. When I was reading this, I'm like, that's exactly kind of what I'd go for. I wouldn't try and increment it like thousands of times first. Could I shift the I assume there was a reason they couldn't do that. So it feels like, 30% of the article, they just were avoiding the obvious solution to their problem. But that's effectively it. Increment their own token using that function call. Like I said, there's more effort into that. It dives into the Windows internal, so it is worth a read if that interests you. But the core of the issue is just because of that not equal false and equals true being used, you create this scenario where you fall into the wrong path or an unexpected path.
If you go to read it, you will want to zoom out the page. This is one thing with the Windows internals blog that I'm not sure why they make the font like so you can read it from across the room. So I had to zoom it out to like maybe 70 or 60% to be able to like read it without having to scroll every half second. But I did want to shout out one thing I like about the Windows internals post too, other than what you already mentioned, is they have a forensics section, so you could actually try to identify if you're being hit with this issue by like looking at their forensic section and looking at the kinds of noise and system state taint that's left by the exploit. I just think that's cool, and it's something you don't really see a lot in exploit write-ups. So that's something I like about the Windows internal stuff. Something I'll shout out that I thought was cool was this bug was discovered internally by Gabe. Um, they found it internally with Syscaller, actually. He tweeted out, awesome to see a write-up of this bug we found internally. I wrote an exploit for it at the time. Really cool to see how other people approach it. So, yeah, we've talked about Syscaller a few times on the podcast, but one thing I've mentioned before is I wish we got to see that Windows version of it, because there is a Windows version of Syscaller. It's just not public. It's internal to Microsoft. So, seems Syscaller is finding some interesting bugs, because the last time I remember looking at Syscaller when it came to Windows, it was mostly just hitting Win32k, and like Win32k, you could hit with like you could probably just push like one button on your keyboard or something and find bugs in there. Like it's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel, buzzing Win32k. But this is kind of showing that Syscaller is finding some more interesting bugs, and this bug, while it is technically trivial, I feel like if you were doing manual code review, it would be easy to miss, because it's one of those subtle issues that's due to how like Boolean logic works. And if you look at the code without paying close attention, I could see how you would think that would be fine. So this is kind of highlighting how fuzzers can find those types of issues that could easily be missed in manual code review. And it's, demonstrating some of Syscaller's value in that respect. But yeah, I just thought that was cool. And it seems there was collision. I think there was another person that ended up finding this as well. Gabe mentions James Hex 40, who also put out a blog post. So if you have multiple sources here for the issue, if you want to dive more into it. So Z, did you have any final thoughts on that?
No, that's all.
Okay, cool. So that we're approaching the end of the episode. That pretty much sums all of our hard topics. I do have a shout out though that I want to make before we jump out here. The CTF write-ups. So HitCon 2020 ran over the weekend. There were some cool challenges. I was actually made aware of it because of discussion with some friends in the reverse engineering Discord about the Spark challenge, which is a Linux kernel pwn. Um, but yeah, I always like it when challenge sources and challenge solutions go out there. And HitCon is kind of a cool CTF, and I love kernel pwn challenges. Those are always fun to see. So anybody who likes to do CTFs or just wants to maybe learn by using CTF challenges, this might be of interest to you. And this repository in general, by the way, they have stuff for lots of different competitions. They have like Played CTF, HitCon, DefCon, Zero CTF. Like they have quite a few things in here. So this repository in general just might be something to maybe follow or watch or whatever, so that you can see some new stuff when it goes up there. Yeah, might be a fun challenge for some of you out there. That being said, that's all the topics we have for this episode. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. You can catch the VODs on Twitch or on YouTube at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific on Tuesday after the stream. We also have previous podcasts up on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and more links on Anchor. You can follow us on Twitter or join our Discord if you want to join the community. You can find the link in the chat or in the description of the video. We'll be back again next Monday at the same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, and we will see you all then.
So before we jump out, actually, there is one thing that we should have mentioned earlier, is that we will be going on break over the kind of Christmas period. I believe we're planning to take off 21st and 28th. There will be 2 weeks without an episode. Do I have that correct, Spectre?
Yeah, so 14th will be our last podcast before the Christmas break. Yeah.
And then we'll be back on the 4th.
Yeah, good shout. That totally skipped my mind that it is in 2 weeks. So thank you, Z, for
give you
bringing
guys
that
a
up.
warning.
Yeah, we can just disappear one day, no podcast. No. But yeah, thank you. Yeah. That being said, we will see you guys next Monday. We will probably mention this again because I totally forgot at the beginning of the episode.